All right, so hello everyone. Welcome back to Static Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. So in case this is your first time, I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers, and we also have Chiara Baroni and Francesco Saracino online. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Mark Fabian speak about how well-being public policy needs more theory. Mark will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And as a reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on the website and on our YouTube channel. Also, in the social media world, we just started our Twitter account, and you can also find updates on LinkedIn. There are going to be buttons at the bottom of our email reminders. You can find us there or search for us. And now to introduce Dr. Mark Fabian. So Mark is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Warwick. He is also an affiliate researcher at Bennett Institute for Public Policy in the University of Cambridge and an associate at the Institute for Social Change in the University of Tasmania. He studies well-being from an interdisciplinary perspective with a focus on policy issues. His work has appeared in the Journal of European Public Policy, Perspectives on Psychological Science, Philosophical Psychology, European Journal for Philosophy of Science, and Journal of Happiness Studies. His most recent book, A Theory of Subjective Wellbeing, is out now with the Oxford University Press. I've started reading it and I'm hoping to do a lot more soon. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Mark Fabian. Mark, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much for the opportunity. Thanks Kelsey, Chiara, and Francesco, and anyone else who's involved in Static. Really value you guys putting on this initiative. I don't know if I'll get through 40 minutes. I'll try to keep this presentation pretty kind of snappy and entertaining, but I'll take my time with it so that we get through. This is joint work with a bunch of my colleagues at Cambridge, Matthew Agarwala, Anna Alexandrova, Diane Coyle, and Marco Felici. Oh, my clicker's not working. There we go. All right, so what's our motivation with this paper? So broadly, there's a lot of motivation, a lot of enthusiasm at the moment for subjective well-being public policy. We kind of go a bit broader than just subjective well-being public policy in this paper, but we are kind of looking mostly at that psychological science into policy kind of advocacy, rather than some of the broader stuff that many of you may be familiar with, like the capabilities tradition, or a range of other things in well-being policy like sustainability science, that sort of thing. We're focusing mostly on well-being public policy in terms of psychological interventions and mostly on subjective well-being public policy. And we're kind of broadly sympathetic to this agenda. We certainly think there's a lot of potential in there, a lot of promise, but also some perils. And we think part of the reason why there's those perils, and perhaps why those perils are particularly concerning at the moment, is because there's a degree of naivety we feel among some of the advocates of this well-being public policy about the nature of well-being policymaking. So in particular, we think there's a very limited causal understanding of well-being change and its mechanisms at the moment, especially in terms of the policies that will promote well-being. So even in some areas where we understand subjective well-being causes reasonably well, I think, like mood management, it's not really clear that the policy interventions are particularly well understood. We think there's also quite a narrow understanding of what well-being itself is. So my colleague Anna has done a lot of work critiquing the way that subjective well-being is usually defined in terms of the measures that are used to evaluate it in this very kind of operationalist style that has a lot of epistemological problems. And then finally, we think there's quite a limited appreciation for how well-being policies are embedded in and contingent upon shifting social structures, and the relationship that has to a lot of the empirical results that currently exist, particularly in this sort of epidemiological style of a lot of subjective well-being research. So these three concerns, we think, and some of the others that I outline in this presentation, all kind of find a common root in the lack of theory, just kind of not enough theory being done in this space. Certainly improving causal inference would also help, but really that too depends on just getting some better theory. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to explain why we think we need better theory, what sort of theory we have in mind, and some other related issues. All right, we're going to open with, I was going to open with some fun examples, but before that, I've got this one slide. So just to sort of set the background a little bit in terms of exactly what we're speaking to. So policymaking is a very broad area. We are responding specifically to what we would describe as a kind of fairly technocratic approach within wellbeing public policy to how they would like public policy done. And we're not really going to get into the kind of political critiques of that. We have other papers where we go into those kind of issues and think about things more from a public administration point of view. For the purposes of this paper, we are just going to accept, kind of meet those papers where they're at, meet that advocacy where it's at, kind of accept where it's coming from. And so that advocacy is very much this kind of science into policy idea. Scientists define what well-being is, figure out good ways of measuring it, figure out ways to improve it. And then we want to see policy interventions that improve well-being. So the idea here is basically that science identifies a causal mechanism that policy can pull, and that's going to improve well-being. That's the idea. Right, now this is fairly common in microeconomics. I guess microeconomics sort of led the charge on a lot of this sort of stuff over the last 50 years. And microeconomics has long emphasized that there is this danger of unintended consequences whenever you do this kind of policy making. That's a theme that's really drilled into economics students. Be careful of unintended consequences. So for example, rent control seems like an obvious policy to improve the affordability of rents, but actually often has the opposite effect. That would be an unintended consequence. And the two bulwarks against unintended consequences that microeconomics has usually emphasized is clear mechanical theories. So you know how if you pull this, what cogs turn until you get the outcome, and you can figure out where things are breaking down in that system. And the second is empirical evidence. Now, I think the main danger with a lot of contemporary wellbeing public policy is actually that it lacks one, not that it lacks two. But it is also weak on two, and it is partially weak on two because it lacks one. So let's try to elaborate on that. But let me just briefly say that economics probably had its high tide in the 1980s with the structural adjustment period. And at that time, economics also was pretty sloppy on the empirics, but was much stronger on the theory. All right, so we're going to start with a few kind of fun examples drawn from this paper by Tyler Vanderweel, where he kind of does a review of some of the empirical evidence around well-being and suggests that there are a few things where the evidence is of such kind of magnitude that it's safe to say that we are ready to make some policy pronouncements on the basis of that evidence. And I'm going to be poking a bit of fun at this paper. I don't mean that in a mean spirit. It's more the case that I have to choose some papers to criticize, and Tyler Vanderweel is a very high-profile scholar in this space from Harvard, and so I kind of think he can take it. And I hope there's no kind of bad feelings about that. It's just a good illustration. Okay, so Tyler argues that there are various things that we think definitely produce well-being on the basis of the empirical results that we have. So one of those is that education improves meaning in life. So I want to kind of unpack that a bit. So let me give you a fun question. So should LeBron James have gone to college? So famously, LeBron James, arguably the best basketballer of all time, skipped college and went straight to the NBA, which is quite an unusual thing to do. Has that reduced his meaning in life? Would he have had more meaning in life if he had gone to college? There's a related question, which is, well, what even is education in this context? So do you need to go to college? Is it about the formal experience of institutional education, or is it about getting more skillful at something that you care about? So if I'm just practicing art and my art improves over time, am I getting more educated? Is that the causal channel here? So what's the mechanism is really the question that we're asking. And one way that we can start to kind of get a handle on the mechanistic relationship between education, whatever that might be, and meaning in life is to think through a nice theory of what meaning in life is. And fortunately, we do have quite a good theory of meaning in life. So there's this three-factor model worked on by a bunch of people, Steger, Hicks, King, Frank Martella, based on a lot of earlier theoretical work in existential philosophy, the kind of logotherapy tradition of Viktor Frankl, these kind of literatures. And they argue that there are three main aspects to meaning in life. There's coherence, that the world kind of makes sense. There's purpose, that you think what you're doing is meaningful to you. And that significance, that you think that the thing that you're doing is kind of worthwhile and makes some kind of contribution beyond your own pleasure or whatever it might be. So how can we then relate this to education? Well, it might be that education opens up meaningful careers that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. It might be that it helps you make sense of the world. So that would be bringing you coherence, Or it might be about providing an ethical foundation for your life, and then it would be promoting significance. And if we use this kind of theory and apply it to LeBron James, then we can see that probably going to college wouldn't have helped LeBron James get meaning in life, because where he gets meaning from is playing basketball professionally and winning championship rings. All right, let's keep moving on. I'm going to unpack this a bit further, but you're going to see the same ideas over and over again. So another common claim, and one that Tyler Vanderweel repeats, is that marriage is good for life satisfaction. And I have to say I have a real bee in my bonnet about this claim. So if this is true, do the Moonies then have it right? So the Moonies are a kind of South Korean Christian cult that gets people married who've never met in these huge mass wedding ceremonies. And they too believe that marriage is good for you. So should we all just also get married in a mass wedding ceremony? Should we all audition for If You Are the One? So this is a famous kind of Chinese game show where single women are there, and there's a kind of guys who want to get married and the women just sort of savage them. And the idea is that eventually they form a partnership and someone gets married. So should we all participate on this and just look for a kind of quick partner? And so the idea here is, well, like, is there something a bit more to it than just marriage? So I have a paper here from Bruce Chapman and Kahit Guan, where they find that actually married people who are in self-assessed, unsatisfying marriages are much less happy than unmarried people. So there seems to be something deeper than just the surface label of marriage, and taking the average effect isn't really informing us as to what's going on. What might make a good marriage? Well, here I have a paper from Sean Grover and John Helliwell, where they find that friendship is one of the more powerful explanatory mechanisms for what determines whether marriage does in fact contribute to life satisfaction. And this then brings up again this question of, well, what even is marriage? What's the thing that's doing the work here in these statistical relationships? Is it a social institution? So you can think of marriage as being a radically different thing in a place like rural India compared to urban areas in Denmark. Those two things are not the same. So we wouldn't really expect them to have the same causal mechanisms, the same effects on well-being. Is it about child rearing and being prepared for that? Is it about having a committed companion, or is it about having a sexual companion? Is it even broader than that? Is it about having a stable, nourishing, intimate, romantic relationship with another person? And this all points to, well, what is the policy lever that we should be pulling? So Vanderweel recommends marriage counselling, something similar to that. But what if that's just prolonging those bad relationships that Chapman and Guan talk about? If in fact the causal mechanism is friendship, the way Helliwell says, Grover and Helliwell, sorry, then it seems like maybe what we should be focusing on is giving people interpersonal skills. And it's really just got not that much to do with marriage at all. All right, last one, religion. So Vanderweel argues, so I've got to move the screen. Vanderweel argues that people who regularly attend religious services have better health, are more charitable, have higher gratitude, trust, forgiveness, less divorce, more marriage, and more social support and friends. So this sounds like really an amazing outcome. You know, we should obviously be getting everyone into religion, and yet religion seems to be declining across the OECD. So something weird's going on if it's really so good for you. But I'm going to ask you a few more fun questions. So should Richard Dawkins, famous militant atheist, really angry about religion, should he convert? Would that be good for him? I presume not. Are all religions created equal? So if I just participate in a prosperity church, or if I go and join tea ceremonies on the outskirts of Los Angeles, or perhaps if I become a practicing Jedi, am I going to get all these benefits? And I dare say the answer is no. So the thing that's operating in religion to cause these things might depend on particular religions, might depend on particular ways of practicing those religions. And so we want to unpack, again, what even is religion? So is it about coherence, purpose, and significance? Is religion kind of filling a nihilistic hole in the soul? Is it about community? So often in a lot of the religious literature, it's about maintaining social networks of reciprocity. So if you look at the sociobiological literature, that's the main thing that they emphasize. Is it about being able to plug into a kind of system of meaning and value? And that's a big part of the kind of the prosperity church's appeal in the United States. Is it about transcendence? So contributing to something beyond the individual, beyond the kind of material in this world, to something grander than yourself? And you might even ask, well, I mean, is there something divine here? Like, do you need God to be real or gods to be real in order for this to have a causal effect? Or is it fine to have something closer to a sort of secular practice? Like fasting can be done secularly, mindfulness, meditation, compassion, a lot of these religious ideas can be practiced secularly and do seem to have causal effects. And what then is the policy lever by which we promote people to get access to all these benefits of religion? All right. Now, having said all of that, you might think that what we need is more causal studies. I mean, I keep talking about what's the mechanism, and causal studies are going to help us identify the mechanism, and there's not a lot of causal studies in the well-being space. Now, I really want to give a lot of credit to Tyler here. He's very careful in his paper not to really overclaim on the basis of statistical evidence, and he calls for better data and better statistical methods, and by better statistical methods, he means more quasi-experimental studies. But I have to disagree with this to some extent. I think we need better data and we need better studies. But I think that better data depends on understanding what it is that we're trying to measure, as do better theory, better studies. So what we actually need to do first, and what would be of the highest marginal value, is more theory and better theory. Better data and methods doesn't address the issue that the causal mechanisms in all these things that Tyler has identified and proposed are deeper than the level at which the analysis is taking place. So the causal mechanism is not marriage. It's something below marriage. So we need to unpack that and theorize it, for example. And better theory and better data and better methods is not going to help you with that unpacking. If you do a causal identification using a quasi-experimental method of the wrong mechanism, so this high-level mechanism, then you're going to get an average effect that's piling in all this other stuff, and that's likely to lead to a bunch of problems that I'll explain as we go through the presentation. There's a big potential here for null effects, which is that you find that a thing doesn't actually do anything. So if it's the institution of marriage that matters, not the relationship, then you're going to get different results for different policy interventions. All right. An additional issue here that I will just flag briefly, but that I in particular have written a very large number of papers on now, is that you need theory just to interpret subjective well-being data. There's this tendency in the field to let the data speak for itself, and I think this is quite dangerous, to be honest. So there are a range of cognitive biases that are well known in social psychology that affect life satisfaction reporting, like effort justification and implicit theories of change. There is a bunch of empirical evidence now that different groups use life satisfaction scales differently. So men and women use them differently, nationalities seem to use them differently, and even satisfied and dissatisfied people seem to use them differently. So people who are at the top of the scale, 8 out of 10 type people, have a slightly different way of using it than people who are lower down the scale. So on this basis, we need to think about when we're doing our intervention, well, are we working with these groups that might be using it differently? And is that introducing bias into our measures and our methods? There is a ton of data, decades of research in the response shift literature in medical science that people often change the way they use their scales or the meaning of the points on their scales before and after major shocks. It's precisely before and after major shocks that we're trying to do our evaluations. So we need to be mindful of these things, and we're going to need theory to figure out where we should be mindful and in what sort of ways. I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I'm quite optimistic about it, but I'm not optimistic about theory 3 econometrics. All right, let me go into some of these problems that I think can emerge if we're not going to be doing this theory that needs to be done. All right, so the first is conceptual confusion. This is what I was pointing to when I kept saying, like, well, what even is marriage? What even is education? This is a paper that I've pulled out, and it's probably unfortunate that I've used this paper because the lead author is a early career researcher. Oh, hi. And we shouldn't dump on early career researchers, but it's still a kind of useful paper to point to. So this paper is talking about the optimal amount of discretionary time as far as well-being is concerned. And I dare say that I think the results here are largely uninterpretable because of the conceptual confusion which stems from the lack of theory. So they define discretionary time as the amount of time spent on leisure activities or other pursuits where the primary function is the use of time for pleasure or another intrinsically worthwhile purpose. Now, the first thing to say is that intrinsically worthwhile will give all the philosophers a fit. Like that's something they've been debating for a very long time, whether that is even a meaningful statement. then you have this issue that for some people, some things are pleasurable, and for some people, things are a chore. So the authors try to use surveys of MTurks to try to figure out which one fits into what category, but there you're just taking an average effect. That's not really resolving the problem that the definition itself is a mess. There's also an interesting way to think about this problem, which is flip the definition. So instead of thinking about the optimal amount of discretionary time, what is the opposite of discretionary? Well, it's obligated. What is the optimal amount of obligated time? I presume it's zero. Like no one likes to have their freedom curtailed. So we just have a lot of kind of under theorizing of the key terms here. That then affects the way the measures are defined and the way the measures are operationalized. And because the measures themselves are confused, the statistical analysis is basically inadmissible. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that this paper, like many, many papers in the field, and I think there's a growing trend in this direction, goes to results on page 2. Like we need to do some theory, some motivation, some explication before we jump straight to the results. Sorry, my clicker's gone. All right. Another problem is that you'll get shifting relationships between your variables at different scales of analysis. So for example, there's this paper by Florida et al., where they find, just running kind of pretty bog standard regressions, that education is quite a weak predictor of life satisfaction at the individual level. It's a very consistent result, but it's quite a strong predictor of life satisfaction at the city level. And my colleagues Marco and Matthew have done some further work on this using UK data. Now, this kind of changing relationships at different scales is usually a function of how you aggregate effects that are heterogeneous across a population. You have to assign different weights to different scales, and what weights you assign to the relevant subgroups is going to affect the magnitude and even the direction of the effect. So in their paper, they find that for some groups, it's a negative relationship, and for some groups, it's a positive relationship. And without theory, we can't really specify that correct aggregation process, and we don't even know what's really going on. It's just kind of operating in the background, and we're unaware of it. There are then 3 other closely related outcomes that I want to elaborate on, which is about robustness, external validity, and then persistence, or what economists call the Lucas critique. So robustness is kind of this idea that something that works at maybe one period in time isn't going to work at another period in time, like Dr. Evil's request for $1 million, which worked really well in the 60s, but not so well in the 2000s. Okay, so say you have a policy that you find works in one area, but it doesn't seem to be working in another area, and that's because you didn't identify the mechanism, because you needed a theory to specify what the mechanism is in the first place. So I'm going to use an example of social prescribing, just because it's quite a common sort of thing discussed in the wellbeing space. Social prescribing is a very large range of treatments, but they all involve embedding people in different social activities. So it might be art, choir, exercise, volunteering, whatever. And often the causal mechanism is believed to be just the socialization itself. So maybe that nourishes people's need for relatedness and it improves their well-being. But there's other mechanisms that are at play in some of these interventions. So for example, there might be a biological mechanism, like if you are socially prescribed exercise, the social element might not be doing anything. It might be the exercise that's lowering your cortisol levels and reducing your stress. It might also be both at the same time. So you need exercise, but the only reason why you exercise is because once you're embedded in a social group, you feel peer pressure to do it. So they happen together. And now the key question here becomes, or a key issue becomes, that the mechanism might vary by person, not just by treatment. And we need to be sensitive to both of those things. So theory can help us with this, right? Theory, if we specify a structural model and we think through, just in the armchair, all the different mechanisms that might be at play, and flesh something out before we think about measurement, before we turn to statistical analysis, then we make sure we capture the things that might actually be doing the work. We can pass out the contextual factors from those causal mechanisms and see whether those mechanisms are in fact doing the work or whether it's something more idiosyncratic. Okay. What's key here is that if we do an experiment, we're doing an experiment of the very particular mechanisms, not the quite fat-handed mechanism of social prescribing. Right? We want to tease apart whether it's the social thing or something more particular to that intervention. So generalizability is closely related to this idea, and it's basically the notion of external validity for those who work in the kind of statistical space. So when you do an experiment like a randomized controlled trial, you get really strong internal validity. So you have certainly identified that pulling lever X or changing variable X does have a causal effect on variable Y. So education and meaning, for example. What you don't get from an experiment is external validity. So if I were to repeat this intervention in a different context, so different social, cultural, political, economic factors around the intervention, will it have the same effect? So famously, a lot of interventions that work in one developing country don't work in another because there are, for example, different religious customs across the two settings. If you try to do microfinance in a country that has really strong laws against usury, then it's just not going to work for you, even if it worked really well in the original context. So what you need here, again, is a mechanistic theory where you can identify what you think does the work. The other thing that you need, which is a big part of Nancy Cartwright's critiques of the sort of overwhelming emphasis on experiments at the moment in policy sciences, is that you need a causal tracking process. So the RCT paradigm thinks about, I pull this lever and something happens over here, but you need to check the pathway by which from that lever it gets to the causal outcome, because then you can think through what could go wrong in your policy intervention when you take it to a different context. All right, a very quick tangent on RCTs here. So I think this is kind of talking more than about the public administration perspective. So I'm very fond of randomized controlled trials. I'm very fond of experiments. I think we need more of them in wellbeing science and definitely more of them in wellbeing policy. However, I worry that a lot of people think of RCTs in this really like paradigmatic way, like that's the only thing that is valid evaluation. In fact, in public policy, most things are not an intervention. It's not like, oh, we did this, what was the causal effect? What we actually have is a policy system that's very complicated with very many moving parts. Think about the health system and all the different aspects of it that produce life expectancy as an outcome. You can't do a causal inference analysis of the health system, right? And you can't do experiments on the system. So we have various tools for thinking through these kind of things. But what I would also suggest is that evidence-based wellbeing policy must mean more than experiments. Let's be a little bit more holistic about how we think about good epistemology in this space. Let's think about, for example, causal process tracing. This is one of the main themes of the public administration literature among academics, that this kind of science into policy view is really naive and just ends up in us not achieving good policy outcomes. All right, last one, the Lucas critique. So this is basically the idea that the impacts of a policy might be endogenous to that policy itself. So famously in post-war macroeconomics, as soon as policymakers identified a statistical relationship that they thought they could exploit, that became public knowledge and it was priced into markets and disappeared from macroeconomic statistics. I'll give you a well-being example. There's some really good literature coming out nowadays about the causal relationship between happier workers and being more productive at work. This is a paper by Bellet et al., really cracking stuff, excellent causal study. Now, firms might try to cynically exploit this result to extract more out of their workers. So they try to make their workers happy, have them have more well-being, feel like their job is their family, but they do this in a really cynical way that workers just kind of react negatively to. And what then happens is that you get a backlash effect, and the effect of these well-being policies is actually negative. So that contradicts the actual expectation that you had based on these statistical estimates. So we want to think about whether the policy effect is endogenous to the policy itself. Okay, let me start to wrap up by just looking at some peripheral issues that come out of this space. So my first concern is that we don't want to keep proceeding in this entirely data-driven way. We want to start folding theory in there. So people often say that medicine didn't make any real progress until it started doing experiments, until it started doing evidence-based medicine, as it's called. And I don't really want to dispute that, but I do want to say that for centuries, medicine only had theory. If medicine only does empirics, that's also quite bad. And I think economists too fail to realize that when they started doing experiments, they had 50, 60 years of theory to draw on that was very mechanistic, very formal, very well developed. we shouldn't go into new fields that we know nothing about and just go straight to experiments, right? Because the increments of knowledge that we take are so small. Let's sit down for a bit, think it through, philosophize, develop a decent theory that's rich, that's got some texture, that makes big inferences, and then test that with theory. And then we will make progress faster. Another reason why we really need to do this is because medicine is quite different from social science. The human body is basically the same over time. So if something works in the 20s, it's going to work today. That is not true for a lot of social science stuff. So we want to be much more sensitive to the kind of broader context of our policies. All right. So I'm suggesting that we put the theory, the quant, the qual all together. And then if we work together cooperatively in this way, we'll get better well-being public policy. Very briefly, I want to encourage people to read this issue of Perspectives on Psychological Science on the theory crisis in psychological science, because I think they rehash a lot of the themes I've talked about. And I think well-being science is one of the areas where this theory crisis is really underway. I flag a couple of things very quickly. Some of the issues are germane to psychology. So fat-handedness, which is that a lot of interventions have multiple mechanisms at play, is just something that we have to deal with. It's really hard, but it's a problem that is just there. No big issue. But other things are quite peculiar to the way psychological science does its practice. So one is operationalism and evidential subjectivism, which, as I mentioned, my colleague Anna has done quite significant critiques of. And another that I want to emphasize is the tendency to just rehash empirical regularities as theory. And that is not an admissible practice. So what you want to do is test your theories. If you're just looking at the data naively and then rephrasing that as theory, then if there was anything wrong with the way you measured your construct in the first place, it's just going to pile in down the way through all your theories over time. All right, this is an example of kind of what I'm talking about, this sort of correlation mongering. So looking at the existing statistical relationships and then trying to put them together into a theory. This approach to theorizing is exquisitely sensitive to all the problems I've outlined. So if social structures shift, all these correlations are going to change. If the Lucas critique is real, all these correlations are going to change. You're not actually really identifying mechanisms here. You're just putting correlations together. You're not developing reasons why these things are related. All right, so what sort of theory do we need? I think a key thing is that the theory should explain how the measures of well-being that we have relate to well-being. Sorry, let me just move my screen a bit. So what goes on affectively, cognitively, and linguistically when people report their life satisfaction to a researcher, for example? What about when they report their sense of worthwhileness in life? We want mechanistic models that yield clear empirical inferences for testing. And I think self-determination theory is a really good example of this. And the general 40 years of research they've done is, I think, very encouraging kind of role model for how we can proceed. Similarly, Tiberius and de Young have some cool work nowadays coming out that I would recommend reading as well. And we should have a theory that illuminates the relationship between well-being items and shifting contextual factors so that we can pass out those contextual factors so that we can control for them effectively. All right, shameless plug for my own book, A Theory of Subjective Wellbeing, which I think does this pretty well, but your mileage may vary. All right, I'm nearly done. Where is causal evidence without a mechanism sufficient? I don't want to say that we need theory for everything. Macroeconomics, central banking proceed without a good theoretical understanding of what they're doing. We still seem to make better outcomes than we had before. So I think where straightforward interventions are concerned, especially where we do already know the mechanisms pretty well, like the Enhance program, which is a collection of mood management training techniques developed by Heinzelman, Ed Dana before he passed, and a few other people. The personal strength literature, good examples. I think for falsification, causal inference is the main thing. And if an intervention just doesn't work, that's a pretty good sign. You can do a lot with that. And then for incremental gains to already well-specified theories. I also think we can just use descriptive statistics for a lot of things. Doesn't need to be causal, don't even need theory. So Carol Graham has done tremendous work just looking at descriptive statistics of well-being across the United States and kind of saw the Trump phenomenon and deaths of despair and all that coming way before anyone else. So it's quite a useful leading indicator. All right, so let me conclude. I think well-being public policy needs more theory. I think more data and more rigorous statistical methods are always welcome. We certainly need more experiments in well-being, but they're not enough here, and I don't even think they're the thing that we need the most. What we need the most is to articulate what well-being is, how its components fit together mechanically, how they interact with external conditions. So we need a better theory of well-being and a better theory of how policy affects that well-being. It's not a demand for perfect knowledge. We don't need perfect knowledge to proceed to policy, but we should be careful. We've got to worry about those unintended consequences, and theory is going to help us through that. All right, thanks very much. Feel free to contact me here or at my brand new Warwick address. I'm just going to turn my light on. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. That's a lot of food for thought. I see we have somebody stepping into the chat right away, Joe Surdy. So Joe, actually, if you would like, you can unmute yourself and make your comment or question. Let's see here, and the same for everyone. So please raise your hands or write in the chat, and we'll go one by one, and then we just need to have it spoken so that it shows up in the recording. So Joe, if you'd like, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you, Mark. It's definitely an informative presentation, and I certainly enjoyed it. We sort of pick your brain, so to speak. Mm-hmm. In psychology and some of the other behavioral sciences, we've been sort of discussing and dabbling with distinctions between what you might call a construct, a hypothesis, a theoretical model, mechanisms between exogenous and endogenous variables, and and theories in the true sense of what we call theory, as well as theoretical paradigms and so forth. These terms are have been debated and discussed in many forms, and the way you're using theories seems to be very what's the word, very loose in the sense that
sure.
Let me give you an example. There is one specific journal in psychology which is called Psychological Review. And in Psychological Review, it takes years and years for a specific psychologist or maybe a team of psychologists to be able to publish in Psychological Review, because in essence, in Psychological Review, they emphasize theory development. And it takes a huge program of research based on empirical evidence to, in essence, advance a specific theory to explain relationships between exogenous and endogenous variables. So in psychology, we use the word theory in a much more definitive sense, based on empirical evidence. They're not just loose ideas. What are your thoughts about this?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. I agree that I kind of use it fairly expansively here. I suppose what I have in mind is something like just what economists would call a model. So if you think of demand and supply as a model, or as the individual workers' labor market decisions as a model where they trade off between leisure and income on one side, that would be an example of a model, and then you want to specify that mechanically. And I would distinguish that from some of the kind of less positivist theory building that you get in other parts of social science that are more concerned with normative issues. So that's one thing. I suppose I'm meeting this kind of technocratic advocacy where it's at, I think. So a lot of that psychological science wants to do what microeconomics has done over the last 30 years. And I think one thing to understand about the influence of microeconomics is the role that its models play. So if you read Danny Roderick's Economics Rules, he really emphasizes that a lot of the influence comes from the fact that it has these kind of nice mechanistic models. In terms of this idea that theory should be based on empirics, I think I sort of broadly disagree with that, but it's quite hard for me to give a succinct answer to what I mean. So I think obviously you need to have an iterative relationship between theories and tests, and you want to build that up over time. So I can understand that Psychological Review, for example, would not want to publish something that was just in the armchair, like philosophical journals would. It would want to publish something that has some credibility, some empirical verification behind it. But I don't think that you can measure something and then derive a theory from your measures. So this is one of the main themes of my book, that the way subjective well-being proceeded was not to define its construct, to have the absolute shallowest definition possible of what subjective well-being is, to just develop a measure. But one of the main problems is that I really think that that measure is not good. And so the reason why they don't see that it's not good is because there's no theory of the construct that they are trying to measure in the first place. And then the theory that you derive from the empirical results is also weak, because the empirical results are not particularly precise. They're not giving you the kind of information that you need. So I completely agree with you. You need some iteration there, but I don't like this idea that you can just have an operationalist approach. Like, the thing that I'm studying is whatever it is that this instrument measures. I don't actually think that that's particularly valid. And I think philosophers of science have done a lot of critiques of that kind of approach. And I think psychology is kind of working with operationalism at the moment and the kind of legacy of it. I think you need a more realist epistemology. I hope that was useful.
Can I follow up on this? Let me also get your thinking or your thoughts on a sort of a hierarchy of concepts that starts out with hypothesis, a theoretical model, a theory, and a law.
Okay.
So in physics, we use laws. You know, if you can be able to establish a law, that's very difficult to try. But ultimately, you know, the goal is to literally establish laws in science. The next level down is a theory. The next level down is a theoretical model. The next level down is a hypothesis. Do you buy
Okay.
into that hierarchy?
I mean, I haven't thought about it too much, but broadly sounds okay.
Got it.
All right, thanks, guys. So next person, we have Sophia. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation, Mark. It was fantastic. I wanted to highlight one point that you made, that you are worried about researchers who just trust the data. Now, I sympathize with this, but there was a recent paper that came out. I guess it wasn't so recent, it was 2017, but it was basically saying that actually psychologists rely too much on explanation and they should focus more on prediction. And so if the goal of policymaking and the introduction of well-being measurements into well-being policy is to actually increase well-being, then do you think that, you know, by increasing our ability to predict well-being and predict which interventions can increase well-being more is well, I wouldn't say like as fruitful as a direction of, for example, focusing on explanation, but do you sympathize with the fact that that is also an important goal, or do you think that explaining and finding out the causal mechanisms to increasing well-being will actually be a more useful way to spend our time?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I think you want to differentiate between different parts of psychological science. And I guess if that article may have been responding to psychology broadly. And there's a lot of complex issues in there around things like fat-handedness that mean that in some cases explanation is more remote or like even harder to do than just kind of accurate prediction. I'm not really convinced that that's the case at Wellbeing, at least at the moment. And I think part of the reason for that is that predictions in Wellbeing at the moment are quite terrible. So there's a paper by Casper, who I see is in the chat, I think, or he was here at some point. Yeah, he's still here. Using machine learning, where they throw like literally every objective variable in the big social surveys into trying to predict life satisfaction, and the R squared only goes up to about 0.3. And that's just not good. Like, that means that there are very significant determinants of life satisfaction that we are not measuring at all. And so I really don't think that we have a good capacity to predict this thing. And I would be really worried that if we started to make predictive policy on the basis of this kind of epidemiological evidence that preponderates in our field at the moment, we would just misfire very often. Now, if as we proceed over the next couple of decades, we find that our ability to explain well-being change doesn't improve particularly much because the causal mechanisms are so complicated. And if you read the kind of psychotherapy literature, that might be the kind of perspective you end up with. Whereas our ability to predict at a kind of high level how things are going to improve over time, including because we've run causal studies that don't really explain the mechanisms, but do show a very strong prediction repeatedly, then I've changed my mind and I will be very open to just taking a more kind of prediction-oriented approach. But at the moment, I don't think we know really good explanations or good prediction.
Thanks, Mark. There was a brief response saying, agreeing with you that in another paper, the variance was in life satisfaction was only explained up to 30%. And so at the moment, I'll respond to that real quickly. We see that variance across country is explained, 70 to 85% frequently. And so what do you think about our reduced form analysis of cross-country life satisfaction? In that case, we are getting at very different things than at the individual level and really explaining quite a bit of life satisfaction.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of skeptical of that too. So let me go sideways a bit with it. So you can explain most of the sustainable development goal variation across countries using just GDP. So GDP predicts like 0.86 or something, the variation in sustainable development goals. But I don't think any of us would sort of agree that we can just keep going on measuring GDP because that tells us like everything we need to know about well-being. And so my concern, I guess, with the ability to predict cross-country what's causing subjective well-being is that what you're predicting is kind of like people's ability to live the life they want to live or something like that. But then within that is really the kind of major causal mechanisms. Do you have something in mind for like what an inference is from that cross-country stuff for how we should do policy?
Well, I'll give you an example. So Casper has some work on this, and I do as well, looking at the generosity of the welfare state, right? So if we look at changes in time, or you can look at quality of governance if you want, social trust, social capital measured using trust, and you can see a change in these variables over time and a correlation. So it's just correlative analysis frequently. And then we see a change in the level of life satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, good one. All right, so this one I'm also skeptical of, but I haven't dived into the data. And if you have and you've got answers to what I'm about to say, then I'm open to changing my mind. So two things. So one is that generosity of the welfare state is mostly pulling up the bottom of the distribution. So if you've read I know you have read my work on scale norming. So people who are 8 out of 10 and above, often if they have an intervention that does improve their life satisfaction, they have no space in their scale to communicate that. So if you're working on people lower down in the distribution and improving their life satisfaction, which is what a welfare state does, then you're necessarily going to see improvements. But it's not clear to me that that's like a true effect or something like that. Like it's just that it's showing up in ways that other effects are not, like the bigger incomes of people in the United States, although I do not want to advocate for the US model. The second point that I think is kind of more significant is that if you take the social welfare states like the Nordic countries, and then you compare them to the liberal welfare states, so Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and then below that you have the US and the UK where there's some other issues. You can plot that ranking of life satisfaction. Okay, you can plot it against generosity of the welfare state, but you can also plot it against just volume of migrants. So the less generous welfare states or the liberal welfare states take in way more migrants. And those migrants tend to have lower life satisfaction. And then once they migrate into those states, their life satisfaction usually improves. So if we're thinking about what's best for people at large across global society, it's not clear to me whether what you want is generous welfare states, which tend to be incompatible, at least politically, if not economically, with high volumes of migration. But if someone's looked into that and can show me that actually migration is not an issue here, then I'm happy to change my mind and say that, you know, giddy up Nordic approach. I mean, I like the Nordic approach anyway, so I'm probably on board with that.
Nice response. I'll have to follow up later with some additional empirical work. We've got 3 more questions right now, so we'll try to keep questions and answers kind of quick. So Casper, you're next.
Thanks, Joseph.
Okay, I will be quick. Mark, that was amazing. That was super cool. 2 questions. First question is, do you have any good examples of sort of quantitative process tracing type work? I'm familiar with a bit of the qualitative stuff, but I don't really know quantitative process tracing work. Second question, what's a good example of a theory-driven well-being paper that you would point us to say, Mark, Fabian approved?
Okay, yeah, cool. All right, on the first question, I don't, but I will get back to you with one. So definitely other people I know will have them and I can find one. I suspect briefly that there is some work in the kind of Bayesian space for things like microfinance where they were doing quantitative updating. On the theory-driven stuff, off the top of my head, I think Deci and Ryan 2000, it's a Target article in, I think, Psychological Review, the journal that Joe was mentioning. It's called like the what, when, and why of goal pursuits, something like that. That would be an example, I think. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Right, thanks. Good questions.
Johannes, you're up next.
Hey, thank you. Hi, Mark. I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks a lot. I think I agree with almost all you said, but I also had some trouble really, understanding what you mean by theory. And I think there's a lot of, probably can introduce confusion because many people will argue, of course, when they do empirical work, that they are also doing theory and so on. So my question is, or I was wondering if maybe what you're saying involves hermeneutics and as a methodological difference, saying that, well, for example, all the examples you gave of education, marriage, and so on, isn't the point maybe that just by looking at data and survey data, we don't really get to the core unless we admit more hermeneutics into the analysis, or maybe even just acknowledging that what we are doing, even if we're not calling it by that name, what we are doing is a lot of hermeneutics by trying to identify what's relevant, what's not relevant for well-being. So this is a hunch that I had listening to your idea.
Yeah, I like that. I'll probably have to think about that a bit more. I think there's definitely parts of what I'm saying that aren't so much about hermeneutics, like model building. So I think, as I said to Joe, like one of the strengths of economics is usually that its models are very clearly specified, quantitative. They plug into statistics really nicely, that sort of thing, and they're fundamentally mechanical because they're formally specified. The hermeneutics, yeah, particularly that conceptual confusion issue and kind of making sure that we define the thing that we're trying to measure clearly, and then how we literally interpret the data does seem to be more of a hermeneutics issue. So yeah, I think about that. I think that's good. Thanks.
All right, Lindsay McLaren, you're up next.
Thanks very much, and I apologize for no camera. Thanks so much for your presentation. I have to say that the title just immediately drew me in. I couldn't agree more that there's this big problem and a need for more theory. And I'm gonna jump onto this conversation about theory, I guess approach or perspective. Is like there's different, I guess, types and levels of theory, as others have talked about, and you're kind of focusing on a particular type of theory that explains mechanisms between different concepts or different variables. But I'm just wondering about your thoughts on, for example, critical social theory or macro level theories, and how you see that fitting into all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you raised this question. Before I forget, Johannes, one thing that I kind of almost said in the presentation, or almost worked into it when I was talking about this tendency to jump straight to results and stuff, is that I think the kind of study of the philosophy of science as part of people's training has just kind of disappeared from academic apprenticeships. And I think this is a real like big issue. Like people having to do so much causal inference statistics instead that there's not much time left over to learn what humanetics is, things like that. So it would be nice to bring that in. And I guess that feeds into your point as well, Lindsay. So I said at the start that in this paper, we really just kind of take the technocratic advocacy where it's at. Like we try to meet them there. We have a whole body of other papers, particularly this paper called Respecting the Subject in Wellbeing Policy, where we talk a lot more about the role of the kind of theories you're mentioning. So the fact that well-being is a value-laden term, and so it can't be defined as a kind of purely scientific object. And then that raises kind of issues of legitimacy around how it is defined, especially in the context of democratic politics, where we think that citizens or the people affected by policy are the ones who should be able to define the value judgments that are operating in that space. And there it becomes, I think, much more relevant then to consider things like critical social theory, all that sort of stuff. So we do have a whole other body of work where we're looking at that. And most of my current research as a policy professor is looking at kind of different political economic structures, different ways of doing public management that would be more alive to those kind of rich social and political theoretical issues. So if you send me an email, I'm happy to forward those papers on to you and give you a better answer.
All right, so we're actually really close to the end, but Mark, if you're willing to stay on, we can still ask some questions. And so I don't see any hands raised at the moment. So I'll take the prerogative of the chair. Oh, Chiara just asked a question, so we'll go ahead and go to her. So Chiara, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the presentation. That was really, really interesting. So you seem to suggest that, I mean, I'm totally convinced that of your argument for this identification of underlying mechanism. But what about the proposal? Where would you look for a theory of well-being? Would this come from the field of psychology? Because in this case, would the result be still relevant to a policymaker that perhaps has an economic background? Related to this, you have done you have given us a couple of examples which are essentially focusing on private choices of people. I would still expect that it would be important to identify the effect or the underlying mechanism of the effect of marriage or religion, but I wouldn't expect a policymaker to act on that. I would hope that the policymaker would not want to act on that because these are private choices. On the other hand, education is not entirely surprising that is different. The individual effect is different from the aggregate effect. But then again, for a policymaker, that would be more interested in the aggregate effect rather than understanding the individual Libron style of outcome, because perhaps my impression is that the aggregate effect actually capture social spillovers, which makes education desirable for the entire society.
Okay, cool. Well, there was a lot in that question. That was a great question. Thanks very much. Okay, so where should the theory come from? I think it should be interdisciplinary, but one caveat to that is I think disciplines think about what well-being is slightly differently. So in my book, what I'm interested in explaining is people's lived experience of their own well-being. I think that that's probably closest to one part of the psychotherapeutic tradition. So like Carl Rogers, Maslow, that sort of tradition is trying to understand people's own lived experience of their well-being and help them be more well. I think subjective well-being is actually interested in something kind of different. It's interested in people's reports about their well-being and what kind of determines those reports. Less interested in the kind of vast psychological hinterland behind those reports. In philosophy, the emphasis is much more normative. I've been really struck by how useless analytical philosophy of well-being is to explaining people's lived experience of their own well-being. What I think a lot of analytical philosophy of well-being is very good for is kind of thinking through these big kind of aggregation questions around social justice. So like the economic definition of well-being is having your preferences satisfied was, I think, mostly settled on for reasons of practical adequacy. Like you can model with that definition very nicely. I don't think it's actually a particularly compelling theory of well-being. So I think we want to bring all these things to bear in policy, because in policy we have to do something that resonates with citizens, is also compatible with policy modeling so that we can do technical analysis, is also politically just, so it's going to need to have ethical principles embedded in it, is also kind of sensitive to shifting cultural conditions, sociological conditions, all these concerns that I think Lindsay's question kind of points to about the social construction of people's preferences and understanding of what's good for them. So we need to bring all that kind of interdisciplinary theory to bear. I think how it manifests in particular areas of policy will be a bit context sensitive. So as you say, in education, education is an area where we do tend to think that we have to pass on some cultural values to our progeny and the young people in our society. So we're a bit more comfortable with government intervention, with paternalism, these kind of things. In other areas, we're much more uncomfortable with those things. We can use political theory to work through how we think well-being should be defined in those cases. My own preference in some of my contemporary work is that well-being policy should mostly be left to citizens to define, rather than psychological scientists. But I nonetheless think that psychological science has a very strong role to play in coming up with some particular policy interventions, just maybe not with the kind of overarching goal of government type definition of well-being. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, thanks. That was a great question. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
So, Mark, I actually have a few questions,
Okay.
but I'm not gonna do that to the audience now. What I'm thinking about it is, because there's a little bit of a theme throughout, right? Is again defining theory. So, you know, I'm thinking about the formal structural models, and it sounds a little bit like that's what you're thinking about when talking about the microeconometric, microeconomic models. But you know, the formal models are necessarily limited for analytical purposes, as partially what you just mentioned. But then, you know, we have other ideas of theory that we think might be relevant. You could have the tracing that you described. So you could think of Judea-Pearl maybe, and using diagrams to just draw the various things. So maybe that is still a model that would work for you, and it's in the economic theory. And then also, if it might be possible to come up with a universal theory of well-being or a grand theory of well-being. And so it's been argued before that that's missing in our field. You gave an example of meaning in life as being derived from three components. Is that a universal theory of meaning that we could aspire towards in well-being? And then I think that wouldn't have a formal definition. So hopefully that's all still somewhat concise.
Okay. So I'd like to think that what I put forward in my book is pretty close to a universal theory of well-being, as far as what I mean by well-being being people's lived experience of if their life is going well or not. And that model of meaning is embedded in my model. So it's one of the bits, but there are many other bits. In terms of how that relates to model building, particularly kind of formal quantified modeling. So I think well-being is an extremely rich thing. Like Casper and I are doing some research at the moment where we interview people and ask them about what determines their life satisfaction. And just the complexity of what comes at you when you ask people that question is immense. Like I have people tell me things like, oh, the most important thing for my well-being lately has been that I realized recently that I just didn't need to talk to my dad anymore. And I've just completely cut off contact with him, and it's been huge for my life. And then you want to understand, whoa, like what's the kind of hinterland behind that statement? Very complex stuff. And if you read psychological case notes, you can see how kind of complex this phenomena is. You want to be able to explain all that richness, but any kind of theory or model is going to have simplification as one of its main things. And I think then the question is, to what extent do we simplify this very complex phenomenon in order to have practical adequacy? So to make the model that we're using relevant to the kind of questions or actions that we're taking. And one of my concerns at the moment is I think that we're in a bit of a rush to do that, because the status quo in policy making, the kind of GDP growth oriented whatever, is clearly sort of coming undone, and doesn't seem to be promoting the good life anymore in advanced nations. And so I kind of think we should recognize that the status quo is kind of played out, but we shouldn't be too quick to think that we already know what the alternative is and that we're ready to just kind of plug it in there, because we're not. So we need an orderly transition between these paradigms.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Last questions. I think that's it then. So Mark, I'll pick your brain again in the future. So
yeah.
always enjoy the conversations. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance, your questions, and thank you, Mark, very much for this intriguing presentation.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
You also had a couple of thank yous in the chat, just so you know. So
thanks,
Chiara mentioned it, Lindsay, Casper, Joe had to leave earlier. So yeah, so thank you very much. And we'll see everyone again in a few weeks. You can see the schedule online. So great, thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Cheers.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.